1899. An American economics professor, the son of Norwegian immigrants, publishes a book that scandalizes the profession. It does not talk about supply or demand. It has no equations. It talks about snobbery. Thorstein Veblen describes how the rich of America's Gilded Age spend money not to satisfy needs but to demonstrate status. Yachts. Banquets. Clothing that serves no purpose except to let others see how expensive it is. He calls it conspicuous consumption. It seems like a frivolous observation. But beneath it lies an explosive idea: the economy does not run on rational individuals maximizing their utility. It runs on social beings who imitate, compete, follow norms, and obey institutions. And if you do not understand the institutions, you do not understand the economy. So far in this part we have seen economists who focus on economic mechanisms: prices, supply, demand, money. The classicals, the marginalists, the Austrians, the Keynesians, the monetarists. They all disagree about which mechanism is most important. But they all share an assumption that individuals make economic decisions more or less rationally. Today we meet a group of economists who question that assumption at its root. They did not ask how markets work. They asked why they work in some places and not in others. And the answer, they discovered, lies not in prices. It lies in the rules of the game. Thorstein Veblen was a strange character. The son of Norwegian farmers in Minnesota, he was brilliant, introverted, sarcastic, and practically incapable of holding a steady job. He became famous for criticizing everyone: the rich, economists, universities, and capitalism in general. His theory of the leisure class, published in 1899, is both a social satire and an economic treatise. Veblen observed that consumption does not follow the logic of marginal utility. People do not buy a €10,000 watch because it is 100 times better than a €100 watch. They buy it to signal that they can afford it. Conspicuous consumption is consumption whose primary purpose is to display wealth. And it is not just a rich person's thing. When someone buys a bigger car than they need, or branded sneakers when generic ones are equally functional, they are doing exactly what Veblen described. But Veblen's contribution goes beyond social criticism. He insisted that economics is an evolutionary science, not a mechanical one. Economies are not governed by fixed laws like Newton's. They evolve, change, adapt. And what drives them is not just prices and quantities but habits, customs, laws, and institutions. An institution, for Veblen, is not just a bank or a parliament. It is any shared pattern of thought or behavior that has become a norm. Private property is an institution. Wage labor is an institution. The idea that going to university is necessary for success is an institution. And these institutions are not neutral. Some favor change and innovation. Others perpetuate privilege and block progress. The economist's task, according to Veblen, is not to build elegant models but to understand how these institutions form, persist, and change. If Veblen was the provocateur, Douglas North was the architect. North was born in 1920, studied at Berkeley, and spent decades working in economic history. He won the Nobel Prize in 1993 for demonstrating something that seems obvious but is not: that institutions are the decisive factor explaining why some countries are rich and others poor. North defined institutions as the rules of the game in a society, the formal and informal constraints that structure human interaction. Laws are formal institutions. Social norms are informal institutions. Together, they determine incentives. And incentives determine economic behavior. His central argument is the following: two countries can have the same natural resources, the same available technology, the same population. And one can be prosperous and the other miserable. The difference lies in the institutions. If a country has a legal system that protects private property, enforces contracts, limits corruption, and allows anyone to start a business, people invest, innovate, and take risks. If a country has a system where the powerful confiscate others' wealth, where contracts are worthless, where bribery is the norm, and where starting a business is a privilege reserved for those connected to power, people do not invest. Why would they, if it is going to be taken from them? North distinguished between inclusive institutions, which distribute power and opportunities, and extractive institutions, which concentrate power in an elite. Rich countries tend to have inclusive institutions. Poor ones, extractive. And moving from one to the other is extraordinarily difficult, because those who benefit from extractive institutions fight fiercely to maintain them. This idea was later developed by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson in Why Nations Fail, published in 2012. But the seed was planted by North. North also introduced another fundamental idea: transaction costs. It is not enough for two people to want to exchange something. They have to find each other, reach agreement, verify the quality of the product, negotiate the price, draft a contract, and make sure the other party complies. All of that has a cost. And that cost can be so high that the transaction does not happen. Institutions exist, in large part, to reduce transaction costs. A legal system that enforces contracts reduces the need to personally monitor your business partner. A stable currency reduces the cost of negotiating prices. A property registry reduces the risk of someone disputing your land. When transaction costs are low, trade flourishes. When they are high, it contracts. And much of the difference between rich and poor countries is explained by the difference in their transaction costs, which in turn depends on their institutions. In 1968, ecologist Garrett Hardin published an essay that became enormously famous, The Tragedy of the Commons. His argument was that shared resources are doomed to overexploitation. If a pasture belongs to everyone, each herder has an incentive to add one more sheep, because the benefit is individual but the cost is shared among all. Result, the pasture is destroyed. The usual conclusion was that commons need either private property or state regulation. Market or government. There is no third option. Elinor Ostrom proved there is. Ostrom, a political scientist at Indiana University, spent decades studying how real communities manage shared resources. Irrigation systems in Spain and Nepal. Communal forests in Japan and Switzerland. Fisheries in Turkey and Maine. What she found was that, in thousands of cases, local communities had developed their own rules for managing the commons sustainably. Without private property. Without state regulation. With local institutions, designed by the users themselves. Ostrom identified 8 principles shared by successful commons systems. Among them, clearly defined boundaries, rules adapted to local conditions, participation of users in rulemaking, mechanisms of collective monitoring, and graduated sanctions for those who violate the rules. The tragedy of the commons is not a natural law. It is the result of a lack of adequate institutions. When communities have the freedom and capacity to create their own rules, they often manage resources better than either the market or the state. Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. She was the first woman to receive it. And her work is one of the most important contributions to economics in recent decades, because it proved that the market versus state dichotomy is a false choice. Another key idea in institutional economics is path dependence. Decisions made in the past constrain the options available in the present, even though circumstances may have changed completely. The classic example is the QWERTY keyboard. It was designed in 1873 to prevent the bars of typewriters from jamming. There are no more jamming bars. But we still use QWERTY. Switching would be so costly that nobody does it. In economics, path dependence explains why inefficient institutions persist. A country that inherited extractive institutions from the colonial era can remain trapped in them for centuries, because the elites who benefit from those institutions defend them, and changing them requires extraordinarily difficult social coordination. Institutional economics has weaknesses. First, it is hard to operationalize. Saying institutions matter is one thing. Measuring exactly how much they matter, and how to change them, is much harder. Institutional economics is better at describing the world than at prescribing specific policies. Second, there is a risk of circularity. Why is South Korea rich? Because of its good institutions. How do we know its institutions are good? Because it is rich. This vicious circle does not invalidate the theory, but it shows the difficulty of establishing clear causes. Third, institutionalists sometimes underestimate the role of geography, climate, culture, and luck. Jared Diamond argued convincingly that geography and ecology explain part of the differences between civilizations. Jeffrey Sachs has shown that factors like tropical diseases and access to the sea profoundly affect development. Institutions are important, but they are not the only factor. When a corrupt government diverts funds that should go to hospitals, it is not just a moral problem. It is an institutional problem. Weak institutions allow a few to enrich themselves at everyone's expense. When a community of fishermen on a Spanish coast agrees on rules about when and how much to fish, and those rules are respected for generations, it is not an accident. It is a functioning institution. When an entrepreneur in a country with a weak legal system decides not to risk his capital because he knows any well-connected politician could confiscate it, he is not being cowardly. He is responding rationally to the institutions around him. Institutions are invisible. You cannot see or touch them. But they determine more than any other factor whether a society prospers or stagnates. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, Veblen showed that economics is a social science, not a mechanical one. Habits, norms, and institutions determine economic behavior as much as prices and wages. Conspicuous consumption is just the tip of the iceberg. Second, North proved that institutions are the decisive factor explaining the wealth and poverty of nations. The rules of the game, formal and informal, determine incentives. And incentives determine whether a society invests, innovates, and prospers, or stagnates. Third, Ostrom proved that market and state are not the only options. Communities can govern common resources sustainably with their own institutions. The tragedy of the commons is not a natural law. It is an institutional failure. The classicals, Marx, the marginalists, the Austrians, the Keynesians, the monetarists, the institutionalists. All these schools, with all their differences, share one assumption, that human beings make more or less rational decisions. That they calculate costs and benefits. That they maximize their utility. But what if that is not true? What if human beings are predictably irrational? What if our economic decisions are full of biases, mental shortcuts, and systematic errors? An Israeli psychologist and a rebel economist from Chicago are going to prove it. And change economics once again. That, next time.